Irreverent, entertaining, cool. You're listening to LA Talk Radio.
You're listening to Remotely Unique with Mary Baca, only on LA Talk Radio.
So hello, this is Lupita Gurula Martinez. I'm actually filling in for Mary Baca today, and I'm speaking to you from Santa Fe, New Mexico. And today the topic that we're going to discuss is all about emotional intelligence. So a couple of weeks ago, there was a show that Mary and I recorded that had to do with fear and overcoming fear. And one of the topics that we discussed was specifically about this, the concept of emotional intelligence. And it's more than a concept, it's an actual tangible thing that's measurable. And so I'm really looking forward to sharing information about what is emotional intelligence, what it isn't, and how it can actually best serve us. So emotional intelligence seems to be a big buzzword these days. And it's something that seems to be misinterpreted. And so I'm really happy to be speaking to everybody today about what it is. So it's oftentimes been linked with a new age concept. And I'm really glad to report that it actually has to do much more than that. It has to do with psychology. It has to do with our personal ability to present and be and exist in the world, and how we perceive our world, and also informing us on how we can respond to external stimuli or to the emotions of other people by picking up on subtle cues. So it's a big hype these days because it is able to help us tap into an ability that we all have and can develop to better exist in our world. It can be used as a measurement of success. Now, the interesting thing is that that has been confused with emotional intelligence with intellectual intelligence. And there was some studies that had been conducted in the early 1990s where those who had average IQ, which is intelligent quotient, or the amount of intellectual intelligence, those who had average IQ oftentimes outperformed those who measured higher IQs. And so because of that, there were large studies that were conducted by multiple universities to discover what exactly that is. And one such pioneer is Dr. John Mayer, who is a professor of psychology from the University of New Hampshire. He is the author of numerous books, scientific articles, and psychological testing, actually, to measure what emotional intelligence is. And so, what is emotional intelligence? Emotional intelligence is the ability to identify and to manage your own emotions, as well as identify the emotions of others. It is generally said to include 3 basic skills. So the first skill is emotional awareness. That includes the ability to identify our own emotions, again, as well as those others. So if you're like me and most people, oftentimes we'll find ourselves having an emotional response that sometimes is less than comfortable, such as irritability, or perhaps we're angry or frustrated and we don't know why. So emotional intelligence is the ability to be able to identify, what am I feeling? All I know is that I'm not feeling good right now, but why am I not feeling good? So having emotional awareness, being able to tune into ourselves and discover what it is that we're feeling. And also the emotional awareness of being able to understand what others are experiencing or feeling. So that will present itself by being able to perceive the facial expressions of others. Some of the testing that was done by Dr. Mayer and his colleagues were to show test subjects various pictures with different emotional facial features. So someone had furrowed brows, eyebrows, or if they had a smile, or also other very subtle differences in perhaps the way their facial features or the expressions were. So they were able to identify by test subjects looking at those photos and being able to discern or understand or perceive what other people are feeling. That's an incredible cue for us to be able to work with others, work with other people in our social environments, with our family and our friends, with our children or our teenagers who don't necessarily communicate with us, but we're able to identify what they're maybe experiencing by what we perceive through this emotional intelligence. It also has been linked with a measure of success, successful people. So often those who are entrepreneurs or work for themselves or are very successful in other realms in the corporate world as well as their own personal world, those have been measured to have a high level of emotional intelligence. And another ability identified, the second ability, is to harness emotions and apply them to tasks that either like thinking or problem solving, decision making. And so by being able to tap into our feelings, understanding what we're feeling, and then being able to use it as a simple guide in order to make those decisions. By being able to perceive our own surroundings, the situation, and others. So it's an incredible skill in terms of learning how to make decisions and how to feel comfortable with the decisions that we make. The other ability is to manage emotions, including the ability to regulate our own emotions and the ability to cheer up or calm down other people. So what that basically states in the example that I gave earlier is that oftentimes we might feel very uncomfortable, having a level of discomfort with our emotions. Again, feeling frustrated and not understanding why. So that's a common thing. I think it's a condition, a human condition, just by fact of being alive and coordinating and cooperating and working with others and living with others in social experiences as well as with work or school. That's a very important ability for us to be able to have, is to regulate our own emotions. And then our also ability to empathize, which means to feel what another person is feeling without making assumptions, but also being able to utilize our skills to help them also shift how they're feeling. So let me give an example of that. So using the example that I've been is if we tend to feel frustrated or upset and we're not sure why we're feeling that way, it requires us to really tune into ourselves. It is a skill of self-awareness, the ability to discern and to sense and feel our own experience. And so something like that could look, the ability to address it could look something like this. So again, if I had an overloaded day and I was met with lots of challenges at work, perhaps there's a big deadline that I'm trying to accomplish, that things quite aren't working well. So there's a multitude of circumstances that is triggering my emotional response, which is irritability, perhaps fatigue. And so we would be able to tune into ourselves to pick and feel how to sense and feel how we're feeling. So, okay, it would require something for us to quiet our mind, to stop our thinking mind, which is that chatterbox that's constantly happening in our head, and being able to say to ourselves, what am I feeling? And we have such a wide range of emotions. And typically people will pick up on, the subtle ones or the very obvious ones, better yet, such as happiness, perhaps joy, elation, a feeling of gratitude, perhaps sadness, anger. But there are also spectrums within each of those emotions as well. So if I've had a long day, and I've had a lot of experiences that seem to not be going my way, I would have to stop for a moment and just tune into myself. What am I feeling? And that is a very unique skill and ability to have that self-awareness. So self-awareness then leads to self-management. So when I'm aware of what I'm feeling and I identify that I'm feeling overwhelmed and frustrated, then I can begin to ask myself, what is it that I need to feel better? So then I could make some adjustments in my situation. Perhaps understanding and discovering how I'm feeling, that self-awareness, can lead me to understand I'm overwhelmed. I have too much going on and I don't know how to meet that deadline, for example. That may lead me to self-management skills of being able to discern what is it that I need to feel better. So in that situation, in that scenario and example that we're using, perhaps it'll lead me to asking for help. Perhaps it'll help me to understand that I need to adjust my schedule and make accommodations. It might lead me to other self-management techniques, such as having communication with others that I might be working with. So again, an extraordinary, unique skill that we can all develop. Another concept of it, or a part of it, is also about social competence. Have you ever been around a group of people where somebody seems to be socially awkward, where they may not be picking up on the cues in the room? Perhaps this person is kind of out of sync with what is happening around them. I think we've all experienced that, or perhaps have been one ourselves. So our ability to read, what I mean by that is to discern, to pick up on the cues that's happening with the people around us, by picking up on the subject that might be in discussion. Again, reading facial expressions of other people, and then allowing ourselves to discern and understand what is happening, not only with ourselves, but other people around us. And so this is a social ability. It also leads to relationship and management skills. So how many times have we actually had a conversation with a spouse or a coworker, and we're trying to express a particular idea, perhaps a problem that needs to be solved, and the other person just isn't getting it. So oftentimes they may misunderstand, thinking we don't know how to communicate, when in reality, it's possible that they may not be understanding or not tapping into their emotional intelligence to be able to read and understand and discern the situation. So social competence is the ability to understand other people's moods, to pick up on their behaviors, and perhaps even have a subtle awareness of what their motives may be in order to improve the quality of relationships that we have. Social competence is really important, and that is driven by our emotional intelligence. And again, like self-awareness is about tuning into ourselves, about understanding what our own emotions are. There's also social awareness. Social awareness is the ability to accurately pick up on the emotions of other people, as we've been talking about in this conversation, and understanding what is really going on. And one way that this is extraordinarily important is about relationship management. And when I talk about relationships, it's not necessarily just with our boyfriend or girlfriend, our spouse. I'm talking about relationships in all of its various forms. So whether that's a relationship with our child, a relationship with our partner or our spouse, whether it's relationship from our coworkers, that's all of the gamut of relationships is included in this umbrella when I speak of relationship management. And that is our ability to use awareness of our emotions and others' emotions to manage interactions successfully. So when we're able to tap into that, again, we can understand where others are coming from. Oftentimes, another example, we may sense and feel that we're having a conversation with someone, but they aren't getting it, as I mentioned before. And perhaps the person that we're talking to is saying the right things, but they don't mean what they say. So a perfect example of this where people may tend to feel that is when we're working with, say, a superior, a supervisor, our manager, our boss, perhaps the CEO of our corporation. Oftentimes we have this need or feel this need to be agreeable. And so we might be agreeing with whatever they're saying, with the direction that they're trying to take a particular project, for example. But because we are aware or are familiar with other dynamics or other situations that haven't been taken into concern, we might resist telling them what we really think about, why their idea won't work. So you can tell and sense and feel that even though the person is agreeing, they may actually give cues by their facial expression or by other things that they are saying, perhaps their body language, their tone of voice, that can lead us to understanding, okay, let's take a pause for a moment. We're not quite on track yet, or we're not in sync with one another. So let's discuss it. So being able to use those subtle cues gives us the ability to better manage and can lead to a better outcome. The project may be more successful and can lead to other opportunities if we have that courage, first of all, to say what we really need and want to say. So in that scenario requires us to understand, well, what am I feeling? Why am I not speaking out what I really need to say about this project? What am I afraid of? So we might discover that the emotion that's coming up is fear. When we dig a little bit deeper, it could be a fear to go against the status quo. Maybe we don't want to speak out, or maybe we're afraid that our ideas will be shot down. There could be a multitude of reasons, but it requires us to understand, why are we responding in the way that we're responding? How does it feel? Does it feel good, or does it feel less than optimal if we're not enthusiastic about it? So it requires that we're checking in with ourselves, and then also having that self-management by, how do I adjust? How do I alter or change what my response is so that I feel better, so that we can create cooperation in that scenario? Now, it sounds like a big, long process, but truly it isn't. It's something that can be very foreign to people if they're not familiar with working in this way. And this is a skill that can be developed over time. And so that's something else that's really positive, to be able to understand how we can utilize, access, develop, and enhance our own emotional intelligence. So there's something else that I need to discuss about this at this moment, that oftentimes emotional intelligence is confused with other personality traits. Again, in this new agey type world where there's a lot of buzzwords about intuition, spirituality, emotional intelligence in this case, it could be misunderstood. So I do need to clarify here that it's not something that is new agey, quote unquote. It's not something that is woo-woo or out there. It's actually a function of our ability to perceive and sense the world. It's more about psychology that is tangible, measurable, and can be accessed. So I want to make sure that that's really clear. And again, in this world of where there's new agey buzzwords out there, emotional intelligence is, again, not like other personality traits. It's not about being agreeable. The other thing to clarify is that it's not about being optimistic. It's not a personality trait. It's a skill and ability. So again, it's not about optimism. It's not about our ability for happiness. It's not about ability to be calm. Those are outcomes of utilizing our emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence itself is a skill. It's a interpersonal skill and an intrapersonal skill, meaning something that we can use for ourselves, and that something we could also apply and use into the greater world outside of ourselves, interconnectedness. So emotional intelligence taps into that fundamental element of human behavior that is distinct from our intellect. Okay, there is no known connection between IQ, which is intellectual intelligence, and emotional intelligence. It is as if those two operate independent of each other, but also do communicate and coordinate together. So again, at the very beginning of this call or this session, we were talking about the difference between intellectual intelligence and emotional intelligence, and how those who oftentimes have a moderate to a lower IQ versus those that have a higher IQ, but yet outperformed those with higher IQ. What was the difference? It was the ability to tap into and utilize that emotional intelligence. It is a flexible set of skills that can be acquired. It can be improved with practice. And even though some people are very natural and more emotionally intelligent than others, that there are ways that we can develop that emotional intelligence. So personality is the final piece of the puzzle. So we all have a unique personality. It's how we show up in the world. It could be considered our personal style. It's how we, again, show ourselves to the world and how the world perceives us. That defines each one of us. So a personality is the result of, hardwired performances. It's how we our go-tos on how we perform or how we interact in social situations. And so we understand and are familiar with that. So an example could be, say that there are two people who have an equal ability. Perhaps they are colleagues. And yet one person has a certain something that the other doesn't. Now, again, intellectually and then their skill ability, they're equal. They can both perform the same task with the same level of success, but yet one person stands out for some reason. So in that scenario, perhaps that person is found to have more interactions with their coworkers. Perhaps people may tend to go to them for certain questions or needing answers. And there's a way that perhaps that person responds to other people. Those are hardwired responses. Again, the personality. So when we can identify that there's a difference between the personality and these skills is also extremely important. So, however, like in intellectual intelligence or IQ, the personality cannot be used to predict emotional intelligence. So one person might be standing out in the example that I just used. Perhaps they're more outgoing, more friendly, more of a team worker. However, the other person might just be a little bit more quiet, more shy. They might not be as outgoing or responsive, but yet that is not a marker for emotional intelligence. The other person might just be a very deep person in the sense that they are sensing and feeling and interpreting all of the cues within their environment, and then be able to make a real strong, discernible action or response. So it's extremely important to understand that this is not about a personality trait about being optimistic or happy. This is more about our ability and our skill in sensing other people. And just like intelligence, that this is something that can be developed. So if a lot of these concepts, as I've mentioned, might seem extremely foreign, but if we stop and break it down, it makes a lot of sense. There is a way that we can actually tap into it. There are also ways to identify where we are in the spectrum. So let's go ahead and talk about that, the spectrum of a person with emotional intelligence. So if someone has a low developed skill with emotional intelligence, they might be that person, again, that misses subtle cues. They might appear socially awkward. They might miss opportunities that are being presented because they aren't aware that what was being discussed was actually an opportunity given to them. They might feel out of sync. Perhaps they aren't making very good decisions. Perhaps the person is extremely irritable and not understanding why. So that a person, again, it has nothing to do with intellectual intelligence. They might be extraordinary in the work that they do, but they miss all of these other subtle cues. Another person who is beginning to develop may extend their awareness beyond just themselves. Okay. And what that requires is that they begin to pick up on subtle cues, perhaps begin to identify facial expressions of others. They might, quote, read between the lines, quote unquote, so to speak. And be able to pick up on other cues around them and where they might become more aware. They might have an experience of where they feel somehow connected to things. Like there's an understanding that kind of links the group together, where people are in flow and in sync, and things seem to be working much better. And that also would use the ability to self-assess, as we've mentioned. So first, they'd have to understand how they themselves are feeling, be able to understand the emotions, being able to state what the emotion is, and then be able to self-manage, and then use that same ability as they extend that to other people as well. So how much does emotional intelligence impact professional success? And the short answer is that it is a huge amount. There's a lot that actually leads to professional success by being able to use our emotional intelligence. It's a powerful, powerful way to focus our energy in one direction that gives us a result of tremendous results. There's a lot of other skills that we can actually tap into and be able to identify that we could, by using this emotional intelligence, say that a person is a presenter. They're able to read the cues of the people that they're presenting to. They may be able to change midstream and go in a direction that the group is, rather than, so it's about being adaptable, because they could adjust in the moment. And so they might be greater success in having that presentation. This can also be used in a multitude of ways. So I've mentioned a couple, which is just our thinking process, our ability to make decisions, but it also has to do with time management, about managing our stress and reducing our stress by that self-management. Also anger management. Again, the example that I used was, I'm really frustrated and I don't know why. So being able to manage that, assess it, and then understand it, we can make those self-management adjustments through self-awareness and decrease our feeling and our outbursts. Okay, so oftentimes people who tend to be angry and have those outbursts are on the low spectrum of emotional intelligence. It also helps us to develop our sense of trust, our trust within ourselves. That when we are able to use our self-awareness to make better decisions, the more and more we're able to do that, we can identify, I make good decisions, which leads to, I trust myself. Another skill that it can help us to develop is our sense of assertiveness. Now, assertiveness is not to be confused with aggression. So assertion and aggression. Oftentimes people tend to associate one along with the other. And that is not the case. So we can be assertive. Our ability to assert ourselves, and the example that I gave was the employee who was afraid to speak out to their boss about a project because they were afraid of what the outcome would be. Maybe they would be chastised. Maybe they were afraid the boss could be angry. So then we are afraid to assert ourselves or declare our ideas or contribute to the project, and which is more damaging not only to ourselves, but our boss may in turn perceive us to be unable to perform the job duties by not speaking out. And so it just creates a huge a loss in a sense, in a situation that just gets worse and worse. So our ability to assert ourselves. So when we understand intelligently, what am I feeling? How can I respond to this? And how can I assert my idea? By having clear communication, contributing something that I have that's important to the work or the group or the project, whatever the case might be. It also helps us to have a sense of accountability. So how many times have we seen someone who just seems to do whatever they please without fear of consequence, right? That's also in development of our success and our ability to interact with others and to better manage our skills in the workplace. It's important that we are accountable. So what does that mean? If I'm accountable for my actions, that means that I take responsibility for the choices that I make, the things that I say, and the outcomes by either doing or not doing, taking action or inaction. And then also understanding that I am responsible for the things that I do. So being accountable. So by understanding that if I do this particular thing that I'm considering doing, this project perhaps, that I am accountable and responsible for the outcomes. It also helps us with our flexibility. So by having this emotional intelligence, we can then be adaptable, as I mentioned before. We can be flexible by understanding that there are other dynamics and things to consider beyond just ourselves. So when we have emotional intelligence, for example, if in the workplace, if we're working on a particular project, if we are so rigid in the ideas that we have and not open to other ideas, then we limit the success of the project because we might miss a really great idea that a coworker may have. In a social setting, if we are very rigid in how we expect the outcome to be. So say we have a friend that is not feeling well and has conditions that make it more difficult to really commit to, say, having lunch on a Saturday. By understanding that there is something going on with our friend, we can be flexible in how we respond, which again leads to better relationship because we are able to adapt and be flexible in our response. In the workplace, again, another extraordinary place that this is helpful to have this emotional intelligence is customer service. So customer service people, I mean, those are the difficult jobs. Those are the ones that actually reach out to the public and, we probably have irate customers. If a person who is a customer service representative isn't flexible, doesn't have that emotional intelligence, one, they might take it very personal. So say someone is upset on the other line because they didn't receive what they needed to receive, or the product didn't arrive when they expected it to arrive. Or they're just angry because of their bill, or whatever the case might be. There's a gazillion examples that we can go with, but just in general, customer service representative who's dealing with oftentimes irate or dissatisfied people. A person who taps into and uses that emotional intelligence can, one, make the discernment that the person who is angry isn't angry at them personally. They're angry at the situation. But again, having that self-awareness and that discernment, they can separate themselves from the other and be able to be in a place of observation. And they can read between the lines what the customer is saying. And so they can also be adaptable in how they respond. And using that emotional intelligence, they can use their skill of really understanding what the problem was of the person who is making the complaint, and then appropriately know how to respond and to rectify the situation. So they can increase sales, they can have return sale. We can gain the confidence of that irate customer by having this skill. And we've talked a lot about social skills, and so having all of these abilities helps our social situation. And again, it also helps with communication. When we are in an argument, say with our spouse or our significant other or partner, oftentimes people are not even listening to one another. They are very rigid in their own feeling of being upset. So oftentimes I recognize in the work that I do, which is a communications coach and a life coach, is helping people to understand how to communicate and that lack of communication skills. Now, people may think they're communicating, but oftentimes they're just talking at the other person. They're not even listening to what the other person is saying. They are not picking up on those subtle cues and not understanding what their real upset is. So oftentimes I can experience people who have issues that they don't even understand what the root cause is. So again, having emotional intelligence helps us to be able to understand that, be able to utilize it in the dynamics to increase better relationships and also to improve our communication skills. When we are using emotional intelligence in terms of in communication, it requires that we slow down. We don't jump to conclusions, that we stop and sense and feel what is it that we're feeling, and being able to identify how we can address it. If we can't understand what we're feeling ourselves, how can we have an expectation that another person would? Again, that's a huge assumption. I actually had a boss several years ago. I worked for 22 years in the service for senior services, so working with elderly senior citizen populations. And I had a boss who was extremely intelligent, such a go-getter. She was extremely impressive, but expected us to automatically know what she was thinking without communicating to us. That would be an extraordinary skill. However, in this day and age, and what's required is that we actually communicate. What is it that I'm feeling? What is it that I want and need? What is the request of the other person to make the situation better? Is it appropriate? Are they in a position to give that? So again, communication skills, relationship skills, and our ability to be flexible. It also helps us with our tolerance. Being able to empathize with other people, we can have tolerance. Now, in this case, I'm not talking about tolerating. Oftentimes, people misunderstand tolerance and tolerating as in having to compromise, having to put up with. But that's not what I'm talking about. This tolerance and our ability to increase our tolerance level is about understanding the other person's situation, understanding what they're feeling and where they're coming from, about extending our understanding beyond ourselves to create cooperation and connection with the other person for a better outcome, which could lead to that sense of peace and calmness that we strive to have in our lives. And another thing with emotional intelligence is our ability to have empathy. And empathy is about our ability, again, to sense and feel what others are picking up on through subtle cues. It's an extraordinary ability that when we can develop this can enhance the quality of our lives in ways that I can only begin to describe, which leads to happier self, happier relationships, more success in the workplace, where things just seem to flow better. Okay, so emotional intelligence, as I've mentioned, can be developed. There is communication between our emotional and our rational brains, if you will. The physical source of emotional intelligence, which is through that. The pathway of our emotional intelligence starts in the brain. It's at the spinal cord, our primary senses enter and must travel to the front of our brain before we can think rationally about our experience. However, they have to travel through the limbic system, the place where emotions are generated. So emotions are generated through the limbic system by the stimuli. What is it that we're sensing and feeling and experiencing around us? And then it's interpreted and actually received in the brain where it creates a biochemical reaction with biochemicals that we respond to and creates emotion. However, they have to first, again, travel through the limbic system, and we have an emotional reaction to events before our rational mind is able to engage. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that we are sensing and feeling our environment and picking up on subtle cues. Because that information travels first through the emotional center, we have an emotional response before we can even begin to rationalize it. Now, that's a very powerful thing to be able to discover, is that there's something happening in there, how the biochemical, the neurological, and how the brain reacts to events and circumstances. So we can begin to develop this. And emotional intelligence requires that we have effective communication between our rational self, our rational brain, which is the prefrontal cortex, as well as the emotional centers of the brain, which is the limbic system. And in all of this, in terms of development, that wherever you may find yourself in utilizing these skills of emotional intelligence, that there is an ability to develop it. It's called plasticity. It's a term that neurologists use to describe the brain's ability to change. Wow, isn't that powerful? It is the neurologist's way to describe the brain's ability to change. So wherever you may find yourself on the spectrum of utilizing emotional intelligence, if you'd like to improve your emotional intelligence, there is that ability of plasticity, how our brain actually grows new connections as we learn new skills. And the change is gradual. It's not something that is going to happen immediately overnight. So we can give ourselves permission to go through the process. And we might have really good moments where we feel like we're really in sync with and utilizing and accessing our emotional intelligence. And we might have moments where we're less than optimal, where we'd like to do better. And so just with practice, again, practice. The more that we utilize these skills and we develop that new ability, then we begin to hardwire those connections in the brain so that we can respond and having those automatic personality responses. So where if right now we feel that we're a little bit on the hot side, meaning that we tend to react either with frustration or anger or lash out, that we can utilize those skills to tone it back, be able to tune into ourselves, to understand what we're feeling, and then be able to have a better response. Now, it takes me longer to actually describe that process than it does to actually experience it. So even though it seems like we're not going to be in a situation where we can take 5 minutes in the middle of a group to stop and tune in and check in with ourselves and do all of this analysis. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that it's a skill that can be developed where it'll be pretty instantaneous. And so it just requires that we're constantly in a state of self-awareness, constantly checking in with ourselves about how we're feeling, checking in with ourselves about how can we better respond. And so the sooner we can develop that skill first for ourselves and then extending it to other people can better our world, better our experiences, and better our relationships. So this is an extraordinary topic that I can go on and on and on. It's a foundational piece in the work that I do, which is empowerment coaching and helping others to understand how they can use and tap into this ability that we all have. And I'm really looking forward to being able to join again here on LA Talk Radio with Remotely Unique. And I will be coming back to finish part 2, and I will have a guest with us. And that will be on June 6th. So Monday, June 6th, I really look forward to continuing the conversation about emotional intelligence. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I thank you for taking the time to listen. Be emotional intelligence. Have fun, enjoy, and make your lives better. Feel better.
You're listening to Remotely Unique with Mary Baca, only on LA Talk Radio.